Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Growing up in Baton Rouge, I always thought New Orleans was where you went to cut loose, and college proved me right. Every memory from LSU in the early 2000s had Bourbon Street somewhere in the background. I was working as a mechanical engineer at a chemical plant outside the city when everything went down. My wife Sarah and I had just bought our first house in Metairie, one of those raised shotgun-style homes with the narrow hallways and high ceilings. Life had settled into a comfortable rhythm of weekend barbecues and Saints games, a far cry from the chaos of my 20s. The reunion weekend started innocently enough. 6 of us from the old crew decided to meet up for Jazz Fest 2019. There was Tommy, who'd become a lawyer in Houston, Brad from our fraternity who sold medical equipment, and then there was Colin. While the rest of us had grown softer around the middle and swapped beer pong stories for mortgage rates, Colin looked exactly the same. Same bleached tips in his hair, same tribal tattoo peeking out from his collar, same energy drink in hand at 10 a.m. He still lived in the same apartment complex near campus, still bartended at the same dive bar, still talked about the epic ragers from 2003 like they happened yesterday. That first night, we hit Frenchman Street hard. Colin was in his element, buying rounds of shots nobody asked for, trying to chat up women half his age who looked at him like their creepy uncle. He kept pulling out this little silver flask from his cargo shorts, taking pulls between beers, his eyes getting that glassy look I remembered from college. The thing about Colin was he never knew when to stop. While we were checking our phones for Uber prices around midnight, he was befriending a group of street musicians, promising to jam with them at some after-hours spot in the Bywater. The last clear memory I have from that night is Colin stumbling into the crowd near the Spotted Cat, his arms around 2 strangers, screaming the lyrics to Piano Man, completely out of sync with the jazz band on stage. Tommy tried to corral him, but Colin shoved him away, knocking over someone's drink in the process. Brad and I exchanged that look, the one that said we were too old for this. We made sure he had the Airbnb address in his phone, watched him weave down Royal Street with his new friends, and called our rides. The next morning his bed was still made, but his stuff was there, so we figured he'd crash somewhere else. We texted him about brunch plans, got no response, and honestly, we were relieved. The weekend was more fun without babysitting a 40-year-old who still acted 19. 3 months passed before I heard from Colin again. It was a Tuesday in August, one of those swampy Louisiana days where the air conditioner can't keep up with the humidity. Sarah was visiting her sister in Dallas, and I was eating leftover jambalaya straight from the Tupperware when my phone buzzed. The number wasn't saved, but the area code was local. The text just said, "I know what you did in New Orleans." Then another, "You all left me to die." Then 5 more in rapid succession, each one more unhinged than the last, talking about conspiracies, about how we'd sold him out, how we'd made a deal with them. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. The voice was definitely Colin's, but different, hoarse, desperate. More texts flooded in throughout the night. Photos of my house from different angles, screenshots of my LinkedIn, pictures of Sarah's Facebook profile. Around 2 a.m. a video came through, shaky footage of someone walking through my neighborhood, the camera panning up to my bedroom window where the light was still on. My chest tightened. I double-checked all the locks, grabbed my old baseball bat from the garage, and sat in the living room with every light in the house blazing. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. I filed a police report, but they said without an explicit threat there wasn't much they could do. I tried reaching out to Tommy and Brad. They'd been getting similar messages. Tommy's wife had found Colin's Instagram, which had devolved into a stream of cryptic posts about betrayal and the night they fed me to the wolves. Every photo was time-stamped from that weekend in New Orleans, but they were all distorted, edited with weird filters that made faces look melted, twisted. In one video, he was in what looked like a basement somewhere, ranting about how we'd drugged him, sold him to collectors, how he'd escaped, but they were still tracking him. Then Thursday night happened. Sarah was still in Dallas, thank God. I'd been working late trying to catch up after spending half the week dealing with security cameras installation. It was past 11 when I pulled into my driveway, the motion sensor light flickering on as usual. But something was wrong with the front door. It was open just a crack, the darkness inside seeming to swallow the porch light. My work laptop bag suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, but my stupid pride made me creep closer. That's when I saw the scratches around the lock, the wood splintered where something had been jammed into the frame. Smart thing would have been to call 911 from my car, but I kept thinking about my grandmother's jewelry in the bedroom safe, the electronics, all our personal information just sitting there. I pushed the door open with my foot, gripping my phone in one hand with 911 already dialed, thumb hovering over the call button. The living room was destroyed, not ransacked like a normal burglary, methodically destroyed. Every picture frame was face down, every book pulled from the shelves and arranged in strange patterns on the floor. The couch cushions were sliced open, stuffing scattered like snow, but the TV was untouched, my gaming console still there. This wasn't about stealing. A crash came from the kitchen, followed by muttering. Not whispers, full-voiced rambling like someone having half a conversation. I recognized the voice immediately. Colin. But the words made no sense. Something about finding the tracker, about reversing the harvest, about how we'd marked him for collection. I crept through the dining room, peering around the corner. There he was, illuminated by the refrigerator light, emptying every container onto the floor. He'd lost weight, maybe 30 pounds, his clothes hanging off him like rags. His hair was completely shaved, revealing scabs and scratches across his scalp. In his right hand was a hunting knife, the kind with a serrated edge. He must have sensed me because he spun around, his eyes wild and unfocused. But here's what made my skin crawl. He smiled. Not angry, not threatening, just this wide, genuine smile like we were old buddies meeting at a bar. "There you are, Mitchell," he said, stepping over the mess of broken eggs and spilled milk. "I've been waiting. You need to tell me where you hid it, the thing you took from me that night." "I know you have it. They told me you have it. Just give it back and I'll leave you alone forever." The knife swayed in his grip, catching the light. He took another step forward, still smiling that horrible friendly smile. My thumb hit the call button just as Colin lunged. Not at me, at the phone, knocking it from my hand. It skittered across the floor, the 911 operator's voice tiny and distant. We crashed into the dining room table, chairs flying. The knife came down, punching through the wood where my head had been a second before. I grabbed his wrist with both hands, trying to control the blade while he pressed down with shocking strength. His breath was sour, medicinal. "You don't remember because they made you forget," he hissed, spit flying. "But I remember everything. The room under Bourbon Street, the men in suits, what they did to me while you all watched." His free hand clawed at my face, fingernails finding my cheek, and I knew I was losing this fight. Pure adrenaline saved me. I drove my knee up into his stomach and he wheezed, loosening his grip just enough. I rolled hard to the left, sending us both crashing into the china cabinet. Glass shattered around us, my grandmother's plates exploding like porcelain grenades. A shard caught Colin across the forehead, blood immediately streaming into his eyes. He staggered back, wiping at his face, giving me just enough time to scramble toward the kitchen. But he was faster than someone that malnourished should have been, tackling me from behind. We hit the refrigerator hard, magnets and photos scattering. The knife clattered away into the darkness under the stove. That's when I heard them, sirens, getting closer. The 911 call had gone through. Colin heard them too, his whole body going rigid. "You called them? You called them?" He grabbed my shoulders, shaking me like a child. "Don't you understand? They're not police. They're collectors. They've been watching since New Orleans. You just signed your own death warrant." He released me and dove for the knife, fishing frantically under the stove. I grabbed the nearest thing, Sarah's cast iron skillet from the drying rack, and brought it down on his reaching arm. The crack was audible. He screamed, rolling away, clutching his wrist to his chest. Red and blue lights flooded through the windows. Colin was cornered between me and the back door, tears mixing with the blood on his face. "I'm trying to save you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We opened something that night. When you left me behind, I saw what follows people home. It's been feeding on me for months. And now it knows where you live." The police were at the door, shouting commands. Colin looked at me one last time, and for just a second his eyes were clear, terrified, completely sane. "Check your shadows, Mitchell, count them. You'll see." Then he charged the officers as they entered, screaming incoherently. They took him down hard, 3 cops wrestling him into cuffs while he thrashed and bit. The aftermath was almost anticlimactic. Colin was charged with breaking and entering, assault, and terroristic threatening. During his psych evaluation, they found massive amounts of methamphetamines in his system, along with synthetic cannabinoids and research chemicals. Turns out after we'd left him that night in New Orleans, he'd gone on a 3-day bender with some local dealers, ended up in a trap house in the 9th Ward, where they'd dosed him with God knows what. He'd been psychotic ever since, living in abandoned buildings, convinced we'd been part of some organ harvesting conspiracy. They sent him to a facility in Pineville for treatment. I haven't heard from him since. Sarah and I moved to the North Shore, got a security system, tried to forget. But sometimes late at night when I'm the last one awake, I catch myself doing what he said, counting shadows. So far, the number's always been right, so far. So I'm sitting here at 3 a.m., unable to sleep, and I keep replaying everything that happened. I need to get this out because, honestly, I don't think anyone would believe me if I told them in person. I'm Lisa, 34 years old, and I work as a marketing coordinator for a small tech company here in suburban Phoenix. I've got what most people would call a pretty normal life. Married to Jake for 8 years, 2 kids, Emma's 9 and Luke's 6, and we live in this cozy ranch house with a decent yard where the kids can play. Jake works construction, comes home tired but happy, and we usually spend our evenings helping with homework or watching Netflix after the kids are in bed. Life was predictable, comfortable, maybe even a little boring, but I loved it. I thought I had everything figured out until November 15th, when my past came knocking. I was folding laundry in the living room when my phone buzzed with a Facebook message from someone I hadn't heard from in 18 years. "OMG, Lisa! Is this really you? It's Vanessa!" The profile picture showed a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that looked too white, too perfect. Vanessa Chen, my childhood best friend who disappeared from my life when her family moved to Oregon during our junior year. We were inseparable growing up. Sleepovers every weekend, shared secrets, matching friendship bracelets, the whole 9 yards. She was the kind of friend who knew all my fears and dreams, who I trusted with everything. Seeing her name pop up after all these years sent this weird mix of excitement and anxiety through me. I stared at the message for a solid 10 minutes before responding, my heart doing this strange flutter thing I couldn't explain. We ended up messaging back and forth for hours that day, catching up on everything we'd missed. She told me about her divorce from some tech executive in Seattle, how she'd gotten into real estate and was doing incredibly well. Her words. She kept asking detailed questions about my life, wanting to know about Jake, the kids, our house, my job, even what our daily routine looked like. At the time, I thought she was just being friendly, genuinely interested in reconnecting. She sent me photos of herself in expensive-looking clothes, standing in front of luxury cars and fancy restaurants. But when I really looked at the pictures, there was something hollow about her eyes, like she was performing happiness rather than actually feeling it. She mentioned she was planning a trip to Phoenix for business and asked if we could meet up. The eagerness in her messages was almost desperate, but I chalked it up to nostalgia and loneliness after her divorce. When Jake came home that evening, I told him about Vanessa reaching out, and he seemed genuinely happy for me. "That's awesome, babe. You always talked about how much you missed her," he said while loosening his work boots. I showed him her pictures and he made some comment about how different she looked from the old photos I had. He was right. The awkward, slightly chubby teenager with braces and frizzy hair had transformed into this polished, almost intimidating woman. But people change, right? 18 years is a long time. I invited her to stay with us for the weekend when she came to town, thinking it would be nice to have a proper reunion. Jake was supportive, even offered to take the kids to his parents' house so we could have some girl time. I was touched by how thoughtful he was being, making space for this important reconnection. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to the way Vanessa's questions about him had gotten more specific as our conversation went on. The week before her visit, Vanessa started calling instead of just texting. Long conversations that stretched into the evening, always when Jake was putting the kids to bed or in the shower. She'd ask things like, "Does Jake still work late?" Or, "Is he handy around the house?" Or, "Does he help with cooking?" Questions that seemed innocent enough but felt oddly focused on my husband's habits and personality. She wanted to know what time he left for work, what he liked to do on weekends, what made him laugh. I found myself painting this picture of our life together, describing how Jake would surprise me with coffee in bed on Sundays, how he'd built Emma a treehouse last summer, how he always made sure to text me throughout his workday. Vanessa would make these little humming sounds like she was taking mental notes. "He sounds amazing, Lisa. You're so lucky." But the way she said lucky made it sound temporary, like something that could change. Friday afternoon, I was rushing around trying to get the house perfect before Vanessa arrived. I'd cleaned everything twice, bought her favorite snacks from when we were teenagers, and even put fresh flowers in the guest room. Jake had taken the kids to his mom's place like we'd planned, and the house felt unnaturally quiet. When the doorbell rang at exactly 6 p.m., I practically sprinted to answer it. Standing on my doorstep was a version of Vanessa I barely recognized. Designer everything, perfectly applied makeup, and this confidence that radiated from her like heat. She was beautiful in a way that made me suddenly aware of my old jeans and messy ponytail. "Oh my God, Lisa," she squealed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and something else I couldn't identify. Her grip was tighter than necessary, lasting just a beat too long. When she pulled back, her eyes were scanning my face like she was memorizing every detail, every line, every imperfection. She had 2 massive suitcases for what was supposed to be a 3-day visit, and when I commented on it, she laughed this tinkling sound that didn't match the Vanessa I remembered. Oh, you know me. I overpack for everything. But the old Vanessa was always a light traveler, preferring to borrow my clothes during sleepovers. As I helped her carry the bags to the guest room, I noticed they were surprisingly heavy. She immediately started gushing about the house, touching everything, running her fingers along the kitchen counters, picking up framed photos, examining the kids' artwork on the refrigerator. "This is exactly the kind of life I always pictured you having," she said, but there was something sharp underneath the sweetness. She lingered over our wedding photos, asking detailed questions about the venue, the dress, how Jake proposed. Then she spotted the family portrait we'd taken last Christmas, all of us in matching red sweaters and genuine smiles, and her expression shifted into something I couldn't quite read. When Jake came home around 8 p.m. to drop off some clothes he'd forgotten, Vanessa transformed instantly. Her voice got softer, more breathy, and she positioned herself so the light from the kitchen window hit her just right. "You must be Jake. Lisa has told me absolutely everything about you," she said, extending her hand in a way that forced him to hold it longer than a normal handshake. I watched my husband's face as he took in this stunning woman, who clearly wasn't the awkward teenager he'd expected based on my old stories. Vanessa asked him about his work, his hobbies, complimented the treehouse visible through the back window, all the things she'd grilled me about over the phone. She laughed at his jokes like they were the funniest things she'd ever heard, touched his arm when she spoke, and somehow managed to mention she was going through a difficult divorce and was so grateful to be around a real family again. Jake was polite, but I could see he was slightly overwhelmed by her intensity. After he left, Vanessa turned to me with this satisfied smile and said, "He's even better than you described, Lisa. You really hit the jackpot." That night, as we sat on the couch with wine, Vanessa started asking about our marriage in ways that made me uncomfortable. "Do you and Jake ever fight? What about? And has he ever made you feel like you're not good enough?" When I insisted we had a solid relationship, she'd nod thoughtfully and say things like, "That's so rare these days," or "I hope it lasts." She kept steering the conversation toward my insecurities, my post-pregnancy body, my part-time work schedule, how tired I always was. She'd agree with my concerns, adding fuel to doubts I'd barely acknowledged. "You know, Lisa, you've really let yourself go since high school. But that's normal for moms, right?" The comment hit like a slap, delivered with such casual cruelty that I actually gasped. When she saw my reaction, she quickly backtracked, claiming she meant it as a compliment about how real and authentic I was compared to all the fake women in Seattle. But the damage was done, and I spent the rest of the evening hyper-aware of every perceived flaw. Saturday morning, I woke up to find Vanessa already in the kitchen, wearing a silk nightgown that barely covered anything, making coffee and humming. She'd somehow figured out exactly how Jake liked his coffee and had it ready when he came downstairs for his morning run. I watched from the hallway as she handed him the mug, their fingers brushing deliberately, her body language screaming invitation. Jake thanked her politely and headed out quickly, clearly uncomfortable. But Vanessa watched him through the window with this predatory focus that made my skin crawl. When I joined her in the kitchen, she was still staring outside. "He has such a nice body for his age," she said casually, like she was commenting on the weather. "You're so lucky he stays in shape. My ex really let himself go toward the end." The way she said it made it clear she was planting seeds, trying to make me worry about Jake's loyalty, his attractiveness to other women. I felt this creeping paranoia start to take root despite knowing better. The rest of Saturday became a masterclass in psychological manipulation that I didn't recognize until it was too late. Vanessa insisted on reorganizing my kitchen to be more efficient, criticizing everything from my cooking skills to my grocery choices. She commented on family photos, pointing out how tired I looked in recent ones compared to older pictures. "Motherhood is so aging, isn't it?" she'd say with fake sympathy. She went through my closet, pulling out clothes and making faces, offering to take me shopping for more flattering options. Every criticism was wrapped in concern, every insult disguised as helpful advice. By afternoon, I felt completely demoralized, questioning everything about my life and my worth. When Jake came back from his run, Vanessa had changed into tight yoga pants and a crop top, doing stretches in our living room. She asked him to help her with a difficult pose, requiring him to spot her in positions that were clearly designed to show off her body. I could see Jake's discomfort, but also noticed him stealing glances when he thought no one was looking. The jealousy burning in my chest was exactly what she wanted. Sunday morning, I found Vanessa in Jake's home office sitting at his computer, in nothing but an oversized t-shirt. "Oh, I was just checking my emails," she said innocently when I walked in. But the screen showed his Facebook page, not her email. She'd been going through his photos, his messages, learning everything she could about him. When I confronted her, she laughed it off as curiosity about how couples communicate these days, since her marriage had failed. But I'd caught her red-handed, and the mask slipped for just a moment. Her eyes went cold, calculating before the sweet smile returned. "You're so paranoid, Lisa. I'm just trying to understand what makes relationships work." That afternoon, she suggested we go hiking at South Mountain, just the three of us, claiming she wanted to experience authentic Arizona nature before heading back to Seattle. Something about the way she said it made my stomach clench, but Jake thought it was a great idea, and I couldn't object without seeming crazy. The trail Vanessa chose was one I'd never been on, supposedly recommended by someone at her hotel. It was more isolated than our usual family-friendly paths, winding up rocky terrain with steep drop-offs on one side. She'd done her research, picking a route that would get us away from other hikers. As we climbed higher, Vanessa kept positioning herself between Jake and me, touching his arm when pointing out views, asking him to help her over rocks she could clearly handle herself. She was wearing inappropriate shoes, designer sneakers with no grip, and kept stumbling in ways that required Jake to catch her. Each accident was perfectly timed, perfectly executed. About an hour in, we reached a narrow section where the path curved around a particularly steep cliff face. Vanessa stopped suddenly, claiming she needed water, and positioned herself at the outer edge of the trail. "Lisa, come take a photo of Jake and me with this gorgeous view behind us," she called, pulling out her phone. As I approached, she stepped aside to make room, but her movement caused loose rocks to shift under my feet. What happened next felt like slow motion. The ground gave way beneath me and I started sliding toward the edge of the cliff. I could hear myself screaming, my fingernails scraping against rock as I tried to find something, anything, to grab onto. Jake lunged forward, catching my wrist just as my legs went over the side, leaving me dangling above a 50-foot drop. The terror was overwhelming. I could feel his grip slipping from my sweaty palm, could see the jagged rocks below waiting to break every bone in my body. But what haunts me most was Vanessa's face in those crucial seconds. She wasn't rushing to help or screaming in panic like you'd expect. She was watching with this calm, almost disappointed expression, like she'd been hoping for a different outcome. It was only when Jake started yelling for her to call 911 that she snapped into action, suddenly playing the panicked friend. As Jake hauled me back up, scraping my entire body against the cliff face, I caught her eye for just a moment. The look she gave me was pure hatred, raw and undisguised. She'd planned this. She'd wanted me to fall. The realization hit me harder than the terror of almost dying. My childhood best friend had just tried to kill me. The hike back down was surreal. Vanessa kept fussing over me, playing the concerned friend, asking if I needed medical attention while simultaneously explaining to Jake how clumsy I'd always been as a kid. She was rewriting the narrative in real time, making it seem like my near-death experience was just typical Lisa being accident-prone. Jake was shaken but focused on getting me home safely, so he didn't notice the subtle ways she was undermining my version of events. "The rocks were really loose there," she'd say. "I'm just glad Lisa wasn't hurt worse. She's always been a little unsteady on her feet." By the time we reached the car, she'd painted such a convincing picture of my clumsiness that even I started doubting what I'd seen in her eyes. But my body remembered the truth. The way she'd stepped aside at exactly the right moment, the calculated timing of her movements, the complete lack of surprise when I started falling. That evening, while I was in the shower trying to wash off the dirt and blood from my scrapes, I heard Vanessa and Jake talking in the kitchen. I crept to the top of the stairs, still dripping wet, and listened to her poison my marriage with surgical precision. "She seems really unstable lately," Vanessa was saying in her most concerned voice. "All that paranoia about me using your computer, and then this accident today. Has she been struggling with anxiety? Depression, maybe?" I heard Jake defending me, but uncertainty creeping into his voice. She continued, "I just worry about her, you know, and about you and the kids. Maybe she needs professional help. I went through something similar during my divorce." She was painting me as mentally unstable, setting up a narrative where anything I said about her could be dismissed as delusion. The worst part was hearing Jake actually consider her words, asking questions about my recent behavior, my mood. By the time I came downstairs, they were sitting close together on the couch, Vanessa's hand on his knee as she offered to help him through this difficult time. The betrayal was suffocating. Working at the downtown accounting firm was supposed to be my fresh start after everything fell apart with Melody. We'd been inseparable since freshman year of college, the kind of friendship where we knew each other's coffee orders by heart and could finish each other's sentences. But something shifted last spring when I got promoted to senior financial analyst and she didn't. The congratulations felt forced, her smile never quite reaching her eyes anymore. Little comments started creeping in about how I was changing and getting too good for our old hangout spots. When she made that cutting remark about my new apartment being daddy's money at my housewarming party, something inside me snapped. I'd worked 60-hour weeks to afford that place, scraping together every penny, while she bounced between part-time gigs. The final blow came on a rainy Thursday in March, when she showed up at my office unannounced, demanding to know why I hadn't invited her to drinks with my co-workers the night before. Her voice carried across the entire floor as she accused me of abandoning our friendship for corporate climbers. The humiliation burned in my chest as my colleagues pretended not to stare. That night, I made the hardest decision of my adult life. I blocked her number, unfriended her on every social platform, and deleted the countless photos of us from my phone. 10 years of friendship, gone with a few taps on a screen. The silence that followed felt both liberating and devastating, like ripping off a bandage that had been covering an infected wound. For the first month, I threw myself into work with a vengeance that surprised even my boss, Mr. Patterson. I stayed late organizing spreadsheets, volunteered for the complicated audit cases nobody else wanted, and even started bringing homemade muffins for the break room on Fridays. My apartment became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe without walking on eggshells around someone else's mood swings. I redecorated the living room, bought plants that actually stayed alive, and started having my sister over for weekend movie marathons. The constant anxiety that had knotted my shoulders for months finally began to loosen. Friends from work started inviting me to their barbecues and book clubs, and I discovered parts of myself that had been buried under years of managing Melody's emotional storms. But then the messages started rolling in. First, it was my old college roommate Jessica texting at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday. "Hey, are you okay? Melody posted that you've been missing for weeks and she's really worried." The confusion hit me like ice water. Missing? I'd been at my desk every day, answering emails, processing financial reports, living my perfectly normal life. Then came a call from my cousin David, his voice tight with concern as he asked if I needed help, if something terrible had happened. My phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications from numbers I barely recognized, all asking the same question. Where was I? And why hadn't anyone heard from me? The surreal nature of it made me question my own sanity for a moment, like I was living in some twisted alternate reality where my existence had been erased. My lunch break turned into a frantic research session as I created fake social media accounts to see what Melody had been posting. What I found made my appetite vanish completely. She'd crafted this elaborate narrative about our last conversation, where I'd supposedly seemed distant and troubled. Her posts painted me as someone spiraling into depression, talking about disappearing and starting over somewhere new. The comments section was flooded with concerned friends offering to help search, sharing old photos of me with captions like, "Please come home safe." She'd even posted a photo of my empty desk at work, claiming she'd gone to check on me only to find I'd abandoned everything. The most chilling part was how genuine her worry appeared in every comment response, thanking people for their prayers and promising to keep everyone updated on the search efforts. The paranoia crept in slowly at first, then hit me like a freight train during my commute home that evening. Every person who glanced at me on the subway felt like a potential searcher, someone who might recognize my face from Melody's missing person campaign. I ducked into a corner deli near my apartment and watched through the window as a man in a baseball cap lingered near my building's entrance for what seemed like an eternity. When I finally worked up the courage to approach my front door, my hands trembled as I fumbled with my keys. The hallway that had always felt warm and welcoming now stretched before me like a gauntlet. Mrs. Chen from 4B gave me the strangest look as she passed, her eyes lingering on my face with an expression I couldn't quite place. Was it recognition? Suspicion? The familiar weight of my apartment door closing behind me had never felt more necessary. Saturday morning brought the most disturbing revelation yet. My landlord, Mr. Kovac, called while I was making breakfast, his usually cheerful voice replaced by something cautious and probing. Listen, honey, I had someone here yesterday asking about you. Pretty blonde girl, said she was your friend and was worried because nobody's seen you in weeks. He paused and I could hear him shuffling papers in the background. She seemed real upset, crying and everything. Said she just wanted to check your apartment to make sure you weren't, well, you know. Had some story about you giving her a spare key? My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the kitchen tiles as the implications crashed over me. Melody had never had a key to my place, and the fact that she'd come looking for one while I was at work sent waves of violation through my entire body. The confrontation couldn't wait another second. I called her from my office phone on Monday morning, knowing she'd answer a number she didn't recognize. Her voice was sickeningly sweet when she picked up, but the moment I spoke, the temperature in the conversation dropped 20 degrees. Oh my God, where have you been? Everyone's been so worried. The performance was flawless, complete with manufactured relief and what sounded like genuine tears. When I accused her of lying, of creating this entire missing person hoax, her tone shifted to something I'd never heard before. Cold, calculating. I have no idea what you're talking about. People are concerned because you disappeared without a word. Maybe you should look at your own behavior instead of blaming me for caring about you. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that for a horrifying moment I wondered if I really had lost touch with reality. But the evidence was right there in black and white across every social platform. Screenshots didn't lie, even when she tried to delete posts in real time during our conversation. I could hear her frantically typing in the background as she claimed she'd only been reaching out to mutual friends because she was genuinely worried. The typing stopped when I mentioned my landlord, and the silence stretched between us like a taut wire ready to snap. When she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. You always were paranoid. Maybe that's why you really did disappear. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the eerily quiet office. My coworkers had gone to lunch and the building felt hollow around me, filled only with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. The next few days passed in a haze of hypervigilance that exhausted me to my core. Every shadow in my peripheral vision could be Melody. Every unexpected knock at my door sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. I started varying my route to work, taking different trains and walking down streets I'd never explored before. The worst part was the not knowing what she'd do next, what new level of crazy this situation might escalate to. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake listening to every creak and settling sound in my building, wondering if she'd somehow found a way inside. I installed a doorbell camera and 3 different locks, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Even at work, I'd catch myself glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see her face pressed against the glass, like something out of a nightmare. The breaking point came on Friday, when my doorbell camera caught her red-handed. There she was at 2:47 p.m., dressed in scrubs like she worked at a hospital, talking to my elderly neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez with tears streaming down her face. The audio was crystal clear as she spun another elaborate lie about being my sister and how our family was desperate to find me. She even had fake medical documents claiming I was suicidal and off my medication. Watching her manipulate this sweet old woman who brought me cookies every Christmas made something primal rage inside my chest. Mrs. Rodriguez was actually reaching for her keys, ready to let this stranger into the building because she genuinely believed she was helping save my life. The sheer calculated evil of it all finally pushed me past the point of trying to handle this quietly. That night, I did something I should have done weeks ago. I called the police and filed a formal report for harassment and attempted fraud. Detective Williams was surprisingly understanding when I showed him the screenshots, the doorbell footage, and the timeline of Melody's lies. We see this more than you'd think, he said, his weathered hands taking notes in a small pad. Social media makes it easier for people to create these elaborate deceptions. The attempted impersonation to gain building access is where she crossed into criminal territory. Within 48 hours, they had enough evidence to pay her a visit. The missing person post disappeared overnight, replaced by a hastily written false alarm message claiming I'd been found safe, staying with family out of state. 3 months later, the entire nightmare feels like something that happened to someone else. Melody moved across the country to Michigan, apparently unable to handle the social fallout when people realized what she'd done. My life returned to its peaceful routine, but I learned something valuable about trusting my instincts and setting boundaries. The restraining order expires next year, though I doubt I'll ever hear from her again. Sometimes I wonder what drove her to such extremes, but mostly I'm just grateful to have my quiet, ordinary life back. Mrs. Rodriguez still brings me cookies, and now she also brings her grandson's homemade salsa, claiming I need more excitement in my meals. If only she knew how much excitement I've had for one lifetime. "28 years old, working as an insurance adjuster in Denver, Colorado, and I thought the worst part of my life was behind me. Had my own apartment, steady job, even started dating this amazing girl named Rebecca, who made me laugh until my sides hurt. Life felt normal for the first time in years, but normal has a way of shattering when you least expect it, and for me, that happened on a rainy Tuesday in February 2023. I was sorting through claim files when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't seen in over a decade. The message was simple: "We need to talk, tonight. You know where." My chest tightened because I knew exactly who it was and what this was about. The past I'd buried so deep I sometimes convinced myself it never happened was clawing its way back to the surface. Kevin Hartley and I had been inseparable since 3rd grade. We were those kids who did everything together, rode bikes until streetlights came on, shared comic books, got detention for the same stupid pranks. By high school, we were practically brothers, and everyone knew if you saw one of us, the other wasn't far behind. Kevin was the wild one, always pushing boundaries, always daring me to do things I knew I shouldn't. He had this infectious energy that made you feel invincible, like nothing bad could ever really happen as long as you were together. That summer before senior year, we spent every day at the old quarry outside town, cliff jumping and acting like we owned the world. Kevin would always go higher, jump farther, take bigger risks. "Live a little, Andrew," he'd say, flashing that crooked grin that got us both into more trouble than I care to remember. I should have known that reckless streak would eventually catch up to us. August 15th, 2015. That date is burned into my memory like a brand. We'd been drinking at the quarry, just the two of us, celebrating because Kevin had finally gotten his acceptance letter to community college. The sun was setting, painting the water this gorgeous orange-gold color, and we were feeling invincible. Kevin kept talking about this girl he wanted to ask out, making all these grand plans for senior year. Then he got this crazy idea about jumping from the highest point we'd never attempted before, this jagged outcrop about 60 feet up that locals called Devil's Perch. I told him he was insane, that we'd had too much to drink, but Kevin just laughed and started climbing. "Come on, Andy," he yelled down at me, "don't be such a chicken." So I followed him up, my heart pounding with every step. When we reached the top, Kevin was standing right at the edge, arms spread wide like he was about to fly. "Kevin, seriously, let's just go back down," I said, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at something in the water below, squinting through the fading light. That's when we saw him. This older guy, maybe in his 40s, floating face down about 20 feet from where we usually landed. Kevin sobered up instantly, and we both scrambled down the rocks to get a better look. The man was clearly dead, had been for a while from the look of it, probably some homeless drifter who'd fallen in during the night. But Kevin, in his panic, did something that changed everything. He jumped in and tried to pull the body to shore, saying we had to help, we had to call someone. I was screaming at him to stop, to think about what this looked like. 2 drunk teenagers at an isolated quarry with a dead body. When Kevin finally dragged the man onto the rocky shore, we could see he'd hit his head on something, probably the same rocks we'd been jumping from all summer. That's when Kevin lost it completely, started babbling about how this was our fault, how we should have found him sooner. In my panic, I made the decision that would haunt us both for the next decade. I grabbed Kevin by the shoulders and shook him hard, telling him to listen to me. "Nobody knows we were here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody saw us come up here. If we call the police, they'll want to know why we didn't report it immediately. They'll smell the alcohol on us. They'll ask questions we can't answer." Kevin stared at me with these wide, terrified eyes, and I could see him processing what I was saying. The man was clearly a drifter. No wallet, no identification, just old clothes and worn-out shoes. Nobody would connect him to us. We could just leave, pretend we never saw anything, and someone else would find him eventually. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But in that moment, it felt like our only choice. Kevin nodded slowly, and we both backed away from the body like it might suddenly spring to life. We spent the next hour cleaning up any trace we'd been there, wiping down the beer cans, making sure we hadn't left any footprints in the mud near the shore. Kevin kept muttering to himself, his whole body trembling as we worked. When we finally climbed back up to where we'd parked Kevin's beat-up Camaro, he turned to me with tears streaming down his face. "Promise me we never talk about this again," he whispered. "Promise me we take this to our graves." I promised, and we shook hands like we were sealing some kind of twisted blood pact. The drive home was silent except for the radio playing soft rock hits from the 80s. We both showered when we got back to my house, scrubbing ourselves raw like we could wash away what we'd seen. The next morning, we woke up hoping it had all been some horrible nightmare, but the local news confirmed our worst fears. Hikers had found the body of an unidentified man at the old quarry. For the next 3 years, Kevin and I barely spoke about anything meaningful. We finished high school like nothing had happened, went to different colleges, and slowly drifted apart the way childhood friends sometimes do. But underneath all the normal teenage stuff, graduation parties, college applications, first jobs, there was this constant weight pressing down on both of us. Kevin started drinking more, getting into fights, failing classes. I threw myself into my studies, trying to bury the guilt under textbooks and term papers. We'd see each other around town during breaks, exchange awkward small talk, but we both knew what we were really thinking about. That dead man's face, bloated and pale in the quarry water, had become a permanent resident in my nightmares. Sometimes I'd catch Kevin staring at me across a room with this haunted expression, and I knew he was remembering too. The worst part was how easily everyone else moved on, how quickly the story faded from local news, how the dead man became just another unsolved case in a filing cabinet somewhere. After college, I moved to Denver specifically to get away from that place, from those memories, from the chance of running into Kevin at the grocery store or gas station. I built a new life, made new friends who knew nothing about my past, dated women who saw me as just Andrew the insurance guy with the quiet smile and steady job. For years it worked. I convinced myself that what happened at the quarry was ancient history, that Kevin and I had been kids who made a mistake and learned to live with it. I even started sleeping through the night without waking up in cold sweats. But deep down, I think I always knew this day would come. You can't bury something that big forever, especially when there's another person out there who knows the truth. When I saw Kevin's text that Tuesday afternoon, my carefully constructed new life crumbled in an instant, and I was 17 again, standing over a dead body with my best friend and making the worst decision of my life. I met Kevin at Riverside Park that night, the same place where we used to hang out as kids before we discovered the quarry. He looked terrible, thinner than I remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and this nervous energy that made him constantly fidget with his car keys. His hair was greasy and unkempt, and he kept glancing around like he expected someone to jump out from behind the trees. "Andy," he said when he saw me, and his voice cracked like he was going through puberty again. "I can't do this anymore. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't even look at myself in the mirror without seeing his face." He started pacing back and forth in front of the old playground equipment, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. I tried to calm him down, reminding him that we'd agreed never to discuss what happened, but Kevin just laughed this bitter, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. That was 13 years ago, man. 13 years of carrying this around like a tumor in my chest. I've been thinking about going to the police, Kevin continued, and my world tilted sideways. Just walking into the station and telling them everything. About the quarry, about the body, about how we just left him there like garbage. I grabbed his arm, probably harder than I should have, and told him he was out of his mind. Did he want to destroy both our lives over something that happened when we were kids? The man was already dead when we found him. We didn't kill him. We didn't cause his death. We were just scared teenagers who made a bad choice. But Kevin pulled away from me with this wild look in his eyes. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I've been having dreams about him. He talks to me, tells me his name was Robert Mitchell, that he had a daughter who's still looking for him. Last week I actually drove to the library and looked through missing persons reports from 2015. My heart started racing because I realized Kevin wasn't just feeling guilty anymore. He was completely unhinged. The conversation went downhill from there. Kevin accused me of being heartless, of caring more about my comfortable life than doing the right thing. I tried to reason with him, explaining that confessing now wouldn't bring the man back, wouldn't help his family, would only destroy 2 more lives for no good reason. But Kevin wasn't listening anymore. He kept muttering about signs and messages, about how the dead man was haunting him, demanding justice. Finally, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm giving you 1 week to think about it. If you won't come with me to confess, I'm going alone." Then he walked back to his car without another word, leaving me standing there in the dark playground feeling like I'd just been hit by a truck. I called after him, but he was already driving away, his taillights disappearing into the night. That was the last time anyone saw Kevin Hartley alive. When Kevin's sister called me 5 days later to say he'd disappeared, I felt this strange mixture of relief and terror. On one hand, I wouldn't have to worry about him confessing our secret anymore. On the other hand, what if something had happened to him? What if his guilt had finally driven him to do something drastic? I helped his family search for 3 weeks, posted flyers around town, even drove back to the quarry to see if he'd gone there one last time. But Kevin had vanished without a trace, taking our secret with him. I attended his memorial service 2 months later, watching his parents cry over an empty casket while I stood there knowing I was partly responsible for their son's disappearance. Afterward, I drove back to Denver and tried to resume my normal life, telling myself that the nightmare was finally over. For 6 months, I almost believed it. Then the first note arrived, slipped under my apartment door on a quiet Sunday morning, written in block letters on plain white paper. "I know what you and Kevin did at the quarry." I still get this weird feeling in my chest whenever I think about what happened that Saturday afternoon, in November 2021. At the time, I was 26, working as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm in Austin, and honestly thought I had my life pretty figured out. Been dating my girlfriend Amy for about 8 months, had a solid group of friends, and was sharing an apartment with my best friend since college, Tyler. We'd been roommates for 3 years by then, and I genuinely thought we were like brothers. Guy knew everything about me, my work stress, my family drama, even helped me pick out Amy's birthday present just a few weeks before everything went to hell. Looking back now, there were probably signs I should have caught. But when you trust someone completely, you don't really look for red flags, you know? Tyler had this way of always being around when Amy came over, always offering to help with whatever we were doing, always asking about our plans. I just thought he was being a good friend. The whole thing started unraveling when I came home early from work that Friday because I was feeling sick. Had some stomach bug that was going around the office, and my boss told me to just go home and rest up for the weekend. I was planning to surprise Amy with dinner at this new Italian place she'd been wanting to try, but figured I'd grab some soup and crash on the couch instead. When I walked into our apartment, I could hear Tyler on the phone in his room, and at first I didn't think anything of it. But then I heard him say Amy's name, and something about the way he said it made me stop and listen. He was talking to someone about how beautiful she looked in this red dress she'd worn to my company's holiday party the week before, describing it in detail like he'd been studying every inch of her. The conversation went on for maybe 10 minutes, and I stood there in the hallway like an idiot, trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was hearing. But when he started talking about how he deserved someone like her, and how I didn't appreciate what I had, I knew something was seriously wrong. I didn't confront him right away because honestly, I was too shocked to process what I'd heard. Instead, I quietly went to my room and started thinking about all the little things that suddenly made sense. How Tyler always seemed to know Amy's schedule better than I did. How he'd sometimes mention things about her that she'd never told me directly. How he always positioned himself next to her in group photos. That weekend, I started paying closer attention, and it was like seeing our friendship through a completely different lens. When Amy came over on Sunday to watch movies, Tyler kept finding excuses to join us on the couch, and I noticed how he'd look at her when he thought I wasn't watching. It wasn't just casual glances, it was this intense, almost hungry stare that made my skin crawl. After she left, I decided I needed to go through Tyler's room while he was at work the next day. I know it sounds like a violation of privacy, but I had to know how deep this went. What I found under his mattress made me want to throw up. Printed photos of Amy from her social media accounts, some of them zoomed in on specific parts of her body, along with a notebook filled with detailed observations about her daily routines. The next morning, Tuesday, I woke up knowing I had to confront him, but I was terrified about how he'd react. I'd been living with this guy for 3 years, trusted him with everything, and now I was discovering he'd been obsessing over my girlfriend like some kind of stalker. I waited until we were both getting ready for work, trying to act normal while my heart was pounding in my chest. When I finally asked him about the phone conversation I'd overheard, his whole demeanor changed instantly. The color drained from his face and he got this look I'd never seen before. Not embarrassed or ashamed, but almost relieved. Like he'd been waiting for this moment. He sat down on his bed and just started talking, telling me how he'd been in love with Amy since the day I introduced them, how he'd been hoping I'd mess up the relationship so he could swoop in and save her. The way he talked about her was disturbing, like she was some kind of prize he deserved to win, rather than a person with her own feelings and choices. He kept saying things like, "You don't love her the way I do, and I would treat her so much better." And I realized this wasn't just a crush that had gotten out of hand. This was a full-blown obsession that had been growing for months while I'd been completely oblivious. What really freaked me out was how calm he seemed once everything was out in the open. Tyler started explaining his plan like it was the most logical thing in the world. How he'd been documenting Amy's preferences and habits so he could be the perfect boyfriend for her when the time came. He showed me a second notebook I hadn't found, filled with detailed notes about her favorite coffee order, the names of her co-workers, her class schedule from the evening pottery class she was taking. He even had screenshots of text conversations between Amy and her sister that he'd somehow gotten access to, though he wouldn't tell me how. The whole time he's talking, I'm standing there trying to figure out how the hell I'd missed all of this. This was my best friend, the guy who'd helped me move 3 times, who'd driven me to the hospital when I broke my wrist skateboarding, who I'd trusted with my spare keys and my deepest secrets. Now he was sitting on his bed, surrounded by evidence of his stalking behavior, talking about my girlfriend like she was some kind of project he'd been working on. I felt like I was looking at a complete stranger wearing my friend's face. I told him he needed to move out immediately, that what he was doing was completely unacceptable and borderline criminal. That's when his whole demeanor shifted again, and for the first time since I'd known him, Tyler looked genuinely angry. Not frustrated or disappointed, but furious, like I'd just insulted his entire existence. He started pacing around his room, muttering about how I didn't understand, and how he'd invested too much time in this to just walk away. I tried to stay calm and reasonable, explaining that Amy was a person, not a possession, and that she'd chosen to be with me, not him. But every word I said seemed to make him more agitated. He kept running his hands through his hair and staring at those photos of Amy like they were some kind of lifeline. When I mentioned that I was going to have to tell Amy about all of this, he completely lost it. Started yelling about how I was going to ruin everything, and how he'd worked too hard to let me destroy it now. The whole conversation felt surreal, like I was arguing with someone who was living in a completely different reality from the rest of us. By the time we both left for work that morning, nothing had been resolved, and I spent the entire day at the office trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't concentrate on anything, kept staring at my computer screen, thinking about those notebooks and photos, wondering how long Tyler had been collecting information about Amy without any of us knowing. Around lunchtime, I called Amy and asked if she could meet me after work. I didn't want to explain everything over the phone, but I needed to warn her about what was going on. She could tell something was wrong by the tone of my voice, kept asking if I was okay, but I just told her we needed to talk in person. The rest of the afternoon dragged by, and every time my phone buzzed, I expected it to be Tyler with some kind of explanation or apology, but he didn't contact me at all. When I got home that evening, his car wasn't in the parking lot, and I found a note on the kitchen counter saying he'd gone to stay at his brother's place for a few days to think things through. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt this growing sense of dread, like we were heading towards something much worse than just an awkward roommate situation. I met Amy at our usual coffee shop downtown, this little place called Brewster's that we'd been going to since our second date. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at our favorite table by the window, and the moment she saw my face, I could tell she knew something serious was wrong. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say during the entire drive over, but when I actually started talking, everything came out in this jumbled mess of accusations and revelations. Amy's expression went from confused to horrified as I explained about the photos, the notebooks, the phone conversation I'd overheard. When I told her about the text messages between her and her sister, she went completely pale and asked how that was even possible. Turns out, Tyler had asked to borrow her phone a few weeks earlier when his battery died at a group dinner, and she'd given it to him without thinking twice about it. He must have forwarded those messages to himself and then deleted the evidence from her phone. The more we talked, the more violations we uncovered. Times when Tyler had shown up places where Amy was supposed to be, information he shouldn't have had, conversations he'd inserted himself into based on things he'd learned from stalking her social media. Amy was terrified, which made me feel even worse for not catching this sooner. She kept asking if I thought Tyler would try to contact her directly, and honestly, I didn't know what to expect anymore. We decided she should stay at her sister's place for a few days until we figured out how to handle the situation, and I promised to change the locks on my apartment immediately. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every little sound in the hallway, wondering if Tyler might come back to collect more of his stuff or to try to convince me to keep his secret. Wednesday and Thursday passed without any contact from him, and I started to hope that maybe he'd realized how messed up his behavior was and would just quietly move out and disappear from our lives. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. Friday afternoon, Amy texted me saying she was going to stop by the campus bookstore to pick up some supplies for her pottery class, and that's when everything went to hell. I was in the middle of a client meeting when my phone started buzzing with call after call from Amy's number, but I couldn't answer because I was presenting a logo design to this important client we'd been trying to land for months. When I finally got out of the meeting 20 minutes later, I had 7 missed calls and a text that just said, "Tyler's here, help." I grabbed my keys and ran to my car, calling her back while I drove, but she wasn't answering. The campus bookstore was only about 10 minutes from my office, but it felt like the longest drive of my life. I kept imagining worst-case scenarios, Tyler cornering Amy somewhere, trying to convince her to leave me, or worse. When I pulled into the parking lot, I could see a crowd of people gathered near the main entrance, and my heart started racing. I pushed through the group and found Amy standing near the information desk, visibly shaking, while 2 campus security guards were trying to calm down Tyler, who was pacing back and forth with his hands clenched into fists. The moment Tyler saw me, he started yelling about how I'd poisoned Amy against him, and how he'd come to set the record straight. Amy rushed over to me and whispered that Tyler had been following her around the store for the past hour, trying to convince her that I was the one with the problem, not him. He'd been insisting that his feelings for her were pure, and that I was just jealous of their connection. The situation escalated fast when Tyler realized Amy had already told me everything. He started screaming about how we'd betrayed him, and how he'd given everything to our friendship, only to be thrown away like garbage. One of the security guards tried to approach him, and that's when Tyler reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out this kitchen knife. Not huge, but big enough to do serious damage. The entire bookstore went dead silent, and I could hear Amy's sharp intake of breath behind me. Tyler wasn't pointing the knife at anyone specifically, but he was holding it like he was ready to use it, and his eyes had this wild, desperate look that I'd never seen before. He kept saying he had to make things right, and that we didn't understand what love really meant. I realized in that moment that Tyler hadn't just been obsessing over Amy. He'd built this entire fantasy relationship in his head where she belonged to him, and our actual relationship was just some kind of obstacle he needed to remove. The security guards were trying to talk him down, but Tyler was only looking at me and Amy, like we were the only people in the room who mattered. For those few terrible minutes, I genuinely thought my best friend was going to hurt someone, possibly himself, over a delusion he'd created in his own mind. What happened next still feels like a blur, but I remember one of the security guards, this older guy with graying hair, talking to Tyler in this really calm, steady voice. He kept telling Tyler that everyone could see he was in pain, that nobody wanted to hurt him, and that the best thing he could do was put the knife down so they could all figure this out together. Meanwhile, the other guard had quietly radioed for backup, and I could hear sirens getting closer in the distance. Tyler seemed to realize this too because he started getting more frantic, waving the knife around and demanding that Amy tell him she had feelings for him. When she didn't respond, she was too scared to even speak. Tyler's face crumpled like a little kid who'd been told there was no Santa Claus. He started crying, still holding the knife, saying over and over that he'd ruined everything, and that nobody understood how much he loved her. The older security guard kept inching closer, talking about how sometimes our feelings get confused and overwhelming, how that didn't make Tyler a bad person, just someone who needed help. When the police finally arrived, Tyler looked at the knife in his hand like he was seeing it for the first time, then just dropped it and collapsed onto his knees right there in the middle of the bookstore. The police were surprisingly gentle with Tyler once they realized he wasn't actually trying to hurt anyone, more like he was having some kind of mental breakdown. They cuffed him, but one of the officers kept talking to him while they waited for the paramedics, asking about his family and whether he'd been sleeping or eating regularly. Turns out Tyler had been staying in his car for the past few days, not at his brother's place like his note said, and had barely eaten anything since our confrontation. The whole obsession had basically consumed his entire life to the point where he couldn't function normally anymore. Amy gave her statement to one of the detectives while I talked to another one, explaining about the notebooks and photos and everything else Tyler had been doing. The detective said they'd probably charge him with stalking and making threats, but that given his mental state, he'd likely end up in some kind of treatment program rather than jail. When they finally took Tyler away in the ambulance, he was going to be evaluated at the hospital before anything else. He looked at me through the back window with this expression that was part apology, part confusion, like he still couldn't quite understand how we'd gotten to this point. 3 years later, I can honestly say I still don't fully understand what happened to my friendship with Tyler, or how I missed all the warning signs for so long. Amy and I are engaged now, planning our wedding for next summer, and we've both had therapy to help process the whole experience. Tyler spent 6 months in a psychiatric facility and then moved back to his hometown in Ohio to live with his parents. He sent me a letter about a year ago, a real handwritten apology where he took full responsibility for everything and explained that he'd been diagnosed with some kind of obsessive disorder that had been building for years without treatment. He said he understood why I couldn't forgive him, and that he didn't expect any kind of response, but that he wanted me to know he was getting help and would never contact either of us again. I never wrote back, and I probably never will. But I kept the letter because it helped me realize that the Tyler who stalked my girlfriend and pulled a knife in that bookstore wasn't really the same person I'd been friends with all those years. Mental illness doesn't excuse what he did, but it at least explains how someone I trusted completely could become someone I barely recognized. Sometimes I still wonder if there were signs I should have caught earlier, but my therapist says that's not a healthy way to think about it. The important thing is that Amy and I got through it together, and we're both stronger now because of what we survived. You know how sometimes you make a decision that seems completely harmless at the time, but it ends up changing your entire life? Well, that happened to me when I was 13, and I'm still dealing with the consequences 7 years later. It all started during my 8th grade year at Lincoln Middle School in Portland, Oregon, which was already a tough time for me since we'd just moved there from California. I was the classic awkward middle schooler, braces, frizzy hair that never cooperated, and that desperate need to find somewhere I belonged. My parents were both working crazy hours trying to establish themselves in their new jobs, so I spent most afternoons alone, either at the library or wandering around the neighborhood with my headphones on. I was the type of kid who genuinely felt sorry for anyone who seemed lonely or left out, which is probably why I noticed Nathan Cross in the first place. Nathan was this quiet, pale kid who always sat by himself in the far corner of the cafeteria, usually sketching in this worn-out notebook while everyone else was talking and laughing around him. He had this mop of dark brown hair that constantly fell into his eyes, and he wore the same black hoodie practically every day, like it was some kind of armor. Most kids either completely ignored him or would occasionally make jokes about the weird art kid. But there was something about the way he observed everything that caught my attention. His eyes were this unusual shade of gray, almost silver, and they had this quality that made you feel like he was seeing way more than he should. I'd catch him staring sometimes, not just at me but at everyone, like he was memorizing details that the rest of us weren't even aware of. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag, but at 13 I just thought he seemed lonely and misunderstood. The day I actually talked to him was a rainy Wednesday in early October. I was walking past his table when I saw he was working on this incredibly detailed drawing of what looked like a medieval castle surrounded by gnarled trees and strange, twisted creatures. The level of skill was honestly impressive, way better than anything I could ever do. Without really thinking about it, I stopped and said something like, "Wow, that's incredible. You're really talented." The reaction I got was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. His whole face transformed. His eyes went wide, his mouth fell open slightly, and for a moment he just stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. Then suddenly he was talking a mile a minute, telling me about all these fantasy worlds he'd created, the stories he was writing, the characters he'd been developing for years. It was like I'd accidentally opened a floodgate that had been sealed shut for way too long. That conversation lasted the entire lunch period, and by the time the bell rang, Nathan looked at me like I'd just given him the greatest gift in the world. He told me his name and explained that he'd been at Lincoln since 6th grade, but had never really connected with anyone before. The way he said "connected" stuck with me. There was this intensity behind it that felt like more than just casual friendship. He asked if we could sit together again the next day, and something about the hopeful, almost desperate look in those gray eyes made it impossible for me to say no. As I walked to my next class, I remember feeling good about myself, like I'd done something genuinely kind for someone who really needed it. I had no idea that I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, or that Nathan Cross was about to become my shadow in ways I never could have imagined. From that day forward, Nathan attached himself to me like I was his personal salvation. What started as sitting together at lunch quickly escalated into him walking me to every single class, even when it meant he'd be late to his own. He would appear at my locker between periods with these small, intricately detailed drawings he'd made of me. And I mean detailed in a way that was both flattering and deeply unsettling. He'd captured the exact way I held my books, the specific angle I tilted my head when I was thinking, even the little scar on my chin from when I fell off my bike in 4th grade. When I asked him how he remembered all these tiny details, he'd get this dreamy look in his eyes and say he just paid attention to important things. The way he emphasized important always sent this weird chill down my spine, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. After all, wasn't it nice that someone finally noticed me? My parents were so wrapped up in their new jobs that they barely asked about my day anymore. But Nathan's attention came with a price that I didn't recognize at first. He started showing up in places where I definitely hadn't invited him. Outside the public library where I went to do homework, at the corner store near my house where I bought snacks after school, even at the small park 3 blocks from my home where I walked our family dog every evening. Each time he'd act surprised to see me, like it was just this amazing coincidence that we kept running into each other. "Megan," he'd say with that wide, genuine smile that made me feel guilty for being suspicious. "What are the chances?" But the thing is, Portland's not that small of a city, and these weren't places that kids from our school normally hung out. When I mentioned this to him once, his expression shifted for just a split second, this flash of something almost angry, before snapping back to his usual eager friendliness. He laughed and said he just liked exploring the neighborhood, especially areas where he might bump into me. The possessiveness started creeping in around mid-December. If I talked to other kids during class or even just smiled at someone in the hallway, Nathan would get this look on his face like I'd personally betrayed him. He never said anything directly, but he'd go quiet for the rest of the day, giving me these wounded puppy dog eyes that made me feel terrible. One time I sat with a group of girls from my English class at lunch instead of our usual table, and Nathan spent the entire period staring at us from across the cafeteria. Not eating, not drawing, just watching with this expression that was equal parts hurt and furious. When I tried to talk to him about it later, he claimed he didn't know what I was talking about, but then launched into this whole speech about how rare it was to find someone who truly understood you, and how most people would just disappoint you in the end. The way he looked at me when he said it felt like a warning, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Things got even weirder when he started knowing things about my life that I'd never shared with him. He knew that my mom had been working late every Wednesday because of some big project at her marketing firm. He knew that my dad had been talking about maybe getting a promotion that would require more travel. He even knew that my older sister Claire had broken up with her boyfriend the weekend before, which was something that had happened at our house, and that I definitely hadn't mentioned to anyone at school. When I asked him how he knew all this stuff, he'd get this secretive little smile and say he was just good at picking up on things, or that I must have mentioned it and forgotten. But I knew I hadn't. The realization that he somehow had access to information about my private family life made me start questioning everything about our friendship. Was he following me home? Listening to my phone calls? The possibilities running through my head were making me paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan knew way more about me than any normal friend should. The breaking point came in January, right after winter break. I'd spent the 2 weeks off visiting my grandparents in Arizona with my family, and I'd been looking forward to some space from Nathan's constant presence. But when I got back to school, he greeted me with this detailed drawing of a desert landscape that looked exactly like the view from my grandparents' backyard, complete with the specific arrangement of cacti and the old wooden fence that ran along their property line. My mouth literally fell open when I saw it. There was no way he could have known what that place looked like unless he'd been there, or unless he'd seen photos. When I confronted him about it, his whole demeanor changed. For the first time since I'd known him, that friendly mask slipped completely, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. He told me he'd gotten inspired to draw desert scenes while I was gone, and that it was just a coincidence that it looked like somewhere I'd been. But his voice was different, flat and almost threatening, and the way he stared at me made my skin crawl. That night, I finally told my parents about Nathan and how uncomfortable he was making me feel. My mom listened with this growing expression of concern, and my dad got that protective look he always got when he thought someone might be bothering his daughters. They decided to call the school the next day to talk to the guidance counselor about the situation. But somehow Nathan found out about the meeting before it even happened. He cornered me by my locker the next morning, and his eyes had this desperate, almost wild quality that I'd never seen before. He begged me not to ruin everything between us, saying that he'd never had a real friend before and that losing me would destroy him. The way he said destroy felt like a threat, and for the first time, I was genuinely scared of him. He kept talking about how special our connection was, how most people wouldn't understand what we had, and how he'd do anything to protect our friendship. Anything. The word hung in the air between us like a promise and a warning all at once. Fortunately, my parents followed through with their plan, and the school took the situation seriously enough to keep Nathan away from me for the rest of the year. They moved his lunch period and made sure we didn't have any classes together. I thought that would be the end of it, especially when my dad got that promotion he'd been hoping for and we moved to Seattle the summer before high school. I remember feeling this huge sense of relief as we drove away from Portland, like I was finally escaping from something that had been suffocating me for months. High school in Seattle was a fresh start. I made normal friends, dated normal guys, and slowly started to forget about the intensity of Nathan's gray eyes and the way he'd made me feel like I was constantly being watched. For 4 years, I lived a completely ordinary teenage life, and Nathan Cross became just a weird memory from middle school that I rarely thought about. But the thing about people like Nathan is that they don't just forget and move on like normal people do. 3 months ago, I started getting friend requests on social media from accounts that seemed fake. Generic profile pictures, no mutual friends, but somehow they knew details about my life that only someone who'd been following me for a long time would know. The messages started shortly after that. They weren't threatening exactly, but they were personal in a way that made my skin crawl. Someone knew about my job at the graphic design firm downtown, about my apartment in Capitol Hill, about the coffee shop where I went every morning before work. They knew I'd gotten a small tattoo behind my ear last year, and that I'd recently adopted a rescue cat named Pixel. The messages always came from different accounts, but there was something about the writing style that felt familiar. Overly formal, intensely observant, and with this underlying current of possessiveness that I remembered all too well. Last week, everything came to a head in the most terrifying way possible. I was having lunch at my usual spot near the office when I saw him. Nathan Cross, 7 years older but still unmistakably the same person, sitting at a table across the restaurant with a clear view of where I always sat. He looked different, taller, more filled out, with shorter hair and clothes that actually fit him properly. But those gray eyes were exactly the same. When our eyes met, he didn't look surprised or embarrassed like a normal person would. Instead, he smiled and raised his hand in a little wave, like we were old friends who just happened to run into each other. My entire body went numb with terror. I grabbed my stuff and practically ran back to my office, where I immediately called building security and then the police. That's when I found out the truly horrifying extent of what Nathan had been doing all these years. He'd been living in Seattle for almost 2 years, had gotten a job at a tech company just 6 blocks from my office, and had created dozens of fake social media profiles to monitor my every move. The police found evidence that he'd been impersonating me online, using my photos and personal information to create fake dating profiles, and even applying for jobs using my identity. The detective told me this was one of the most sophisticated stalking cases he'd ever seen. Nathan had essentially been living a parallel version of my life, and I'd had no idea. They arrested him that same day, and he's currently facing multiple charges for identity theft, cyberstalking, and harassment. I still can't sleep properly, knowing that for 7 years, he never stopped watching me, never stopped believing that we had some kind of special connection that justified all of this. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never been kind to that lonely kid in the cafeteria. But then I remember that people like Nathan don't need a reason. They just need a target. About 6 months ago, I made what seemed like a simple decision to help out a friend in need. Brandon had been my buddy since college. We'd known each other for almost 10 years, hung out regularly, grabbed beers, played video games, the whole deal. He was always a bit quirky, sure, but in that harmless way where he'd obsess over weird conspiracy theories or spend hours researching random topics online. I'm a 28-year-old software developer working remotely from my 2-bedroom apartment in Tampa, making decent money and living a pretty routine life. My days were predictable. Wake up, work from my home office, maybe go for a run, order takeout, rinse and repeat. The extra bedroom had become my storage room and occasional guest space. When Brandon called me that Tuesday in March 2023, he sounded desperate in a way I'd never heard before. He'd lost his job at the marketing firm where he'd worked for 3 years, and his landlord was kicking him out because he couldn't make rent. His voice had this shaky quality to it, like he was on the verge of tears but trying to hold it together. Brandon explained that his parents had cut him off financially after some big fight, and he had nowhere else to turn. He asked if he could crash on my couch for just a few weeks until he got back on his feet. The guy had always been there for me during my rough patches in college, so of course I said yes without hesitation. I figured 2 or 3 weeks max, maybe a month if job hunting took longer than expected. I cleared out some space in my living room, bought an air mattress and told him he could move in that Friday. The plan seemed straightforward enough. He'd job hunt during the day while I worked. We'd hang out in the evenings like old times, and once he found something stable, he'd move out. What could go wrong, right? The first week went exactly as I expected. Brandon was grateful, respectful, and actually pretty good company. He'd wake up early, shower, and spend most of the day on his laptop applying for jobs or on the phone with recruiters. He kept the living room tidy, did his own dishes, and even cooked dinner for both of us a couple times. We'd watch Netflix together after I finished work, just like back in our college dorm days. He seemed motivated and optimistic about his prospects, showing me job listings he'd applied to and talking about interviews he had lined up. I actually started thinking this arrangement might work out better than I'd hoped. Having someone around made the apartment feel less lonely, and it was nice to have a friend to decompress with after long days of coding. Brandon even helped me fix some tech issues I'd been putting off, like setting up my smart TV properly and organizing my cable management. Those first 7 days, I genuinely enjoyed having him around. Week 2 was when I started noticing small changes in Brandon's behavior, though at the time, I brushed them off as stress from unemployment. He'd stay up much later than before, often still awake when I went to bed around midnight, just sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone with this intense focus. Sometimes I'd wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and find him still in the exact same position, staring at his screen in the dark. When I asked what he was doing, he'd say he was researching opportunities or networking online, but his answers felt vague and rehearsed. He also started asking weird questions about my work schedule, like exactly what time I took lunch breaks or when I had important calls. At first, I thought he was just being considerate, trying not to disturb me during crucial work hours. But then he began positioning himself near my home office door during my video meetings, and I'd catch glimpses of him just standing there in the hallway, perfectly still. When I mentioned it, he'd laugh it off and say he was just waiting to use the bathroom, but the bathroom was in the opposite direction. By the 3rd week, Brandon's job search seemed to have completely stalled, but he never appeared worried about it anymore. Instead of spending his days applying for positions, he'd wander around my apartment with this curious, exploratory attitude, like he was mapping out every corner. I'd come out of my office for lunch and find him in my bedroom, claiming he was looking for the vacuum cleaner, even though I kept it in the hall closet and he knew that. Once I caught him going through my mail on the kitchen counter, holding up each envelope and examining the return addresses carefully. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was just organizing it for me, but the mail had already been perfectly organized. His explanations for everything became increasingly elaborate and detailed, like he was overcompensating for something. The way he'd pause for just a moment too long before answering simple questions made my skin crawl. Most unsettling was how he'd started responding to conversations I was having in my office during work calls, even though my door was closed and he shouldn't have been able to hear what I was saying. The fourth week brought a new level of strange behavior that I couldn't ignore anymore. Brandon began rearranging small things throughout my apartment, not in any helpful way, but in ways that made no sense. I'd find my coffee mugs moved to different shelves, my books reorganized by height instead of topic, and my bathroom supplies switched around for no apparent reason. When I confronted him about it, he'd get this confused expression and insist he hadn't touched anything, even when I'd literally watched him do it an hour earlier. He also started having these intense phone conversations in whispered tones, always facing away from me and walking to the far end of the room. The conversations would go on for hours, but I never heard him mention job interviews or potential employers. Instead, I'd catch fragments about keeping track and maintaining position and gathering information. Most disturbing was when I realized he'd somehow gotten hold of my apartment building's master key schedule, because he knew exactly when the maintenance staff came by, even though I'd never told him, and this was information I barely knew myself. The breaking point came during week 5, when I discovered Brandon had been systematically going through my personal belongings while I was in my office working. I found fingerprint smudges on my laptop screen, which I always kept closed when not in use, and my desk drawers had been rifled through despite having nothing valuable in them. My important documents folder had been completely reorganized, and several items were missing, including my lease agreement and some bank statements. When I checked my browser history, there were searches for my full name, my employer, and even some of my family members that I'd never made. That evening, I heard him on the phone again, and this time I pressed my ear to my bedroom door to listen. He was giving someone a detailed description of my daily routine, down to what time I typically ordered food and which apps I used most frequently. His voice had this cold, clinical quality that I'd never heard before, like he was filing a report rather than having a conversation. The person on the other end seemed to be asking specific questions about my apartment layout and my work schedule, and Brandon answered everything with frightening precision. After that phone call, I knew I had to confront the situation head-on. The next morning, I waited until Brandon finished his shower and sat him down at my kitchen table. I told him straight up that his few weeks had stretched into over a month, and I needed him to start making concrete plans to move out. His reaction was unlike anything I'd seen from him before. His entire demeanor shifted from the friendly, grateful guest to someone completely different. His eyes went flat and expressionless, and he stared at me without blinking for what felt like an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was monotone and measured, nothing like his usual animated way of talking. He said he wasn't ready to leave yet, that he needed more time to complete his assessment of the situation. Those exact words, complete his assessment, like I was some kind of case study rather than his friend. When I pressed him about what that meant, he just repeated that he needed more time and that moving out right now wouldn't be optimal for anyone involved. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours, and I walked away more confused and unsettled than before. Over the next few days, Brandon's behavior escalated to a level that made me genuinely fear for my safety. He stopped pretending to look for jobs entirely, and instead spent his time creating what I can only describe as surveillance notes about me. I found scraps of paper hidden around the apartment with my daily activities written down in his handwriting. Things like leaves office at 12:17 p.m. for lunch, orders Thai food every Tuesday, and calls mother on Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. He'd also started locking himself in the bathroom for hours at a time, and I could hear him talking to someone on the phone in there, though the words were too muffled to make out. The most disturbing part was that he'd begun moving furniture around in the middle of the night, not rearranging it in any functional way, but positioning chairs and tables so he could sit in specific spots that gave him clear sight lines to both my bedroom door and my office entrance. When I woke up one morning to find my couch pushed against the wall, at an angle that blocked my path to the front door, I realized he wasn't just being weird anymore. He was actively trying to control my movement within my own apartment. The situation reached a terrifying climax on a Friday evening in early May, when I decided I'd had enough. I came home from a rare day at the office to find Brandon had somehow gotten into my bedroom and was sitting on my bed, going through my personal photo albums. He had pictures of my family, my ex-girlfriend, and my friends spread out in front of him like he was studying them for a test. When I demanded to know what he was doing, he calmly explained that he was building profiles of the important people in my life. His tone was so casual, like this was the most normal thing in the world. I told him he had to leave immediately, that this had gone way too far, and I wanted him out by the end of the weekend. That's when his mask completely dropped. He stood up slowly, never breaking eye contact, and told me in this chillingly quiet voice that I didn't get to make that decision anymore. He said he'd invested too much time and effort into this project to walk away now, and that he had information about me that could make my life very difficult if I didn't cooperate. The way he said cooperate made my entire body tense up. It wasn't a request, it was a threat. When I tried to move toward him to grab my photos back, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength and squeezed until I gasped. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Brandon released my wrist and walked calmly to my kitchen, returning with one of my largest knives. He didn't wave it around or make dramatic gestures. He just held it loosely at his side while explaining, in that same eerily calm voice, that he'd been hired to monitor my activities and that his job wasn't finished yet. He mentioned specific details about my bank account, my work projects, and even conversations I'd had with my parents that he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd been recording everything. The knife wasn't necessarily a direct threat, but its presence made it clear that he was prepared to use violence if I didn't comply with whatever twisted plan he had. He told me that his employers were very interested in my work, particularly a new software project I'd been developing for my company. He'd been feeding them information for weeks, and they wanted more detailed technical specifications that he couldn't access without my cooperation. The whole time he spoke, he kept running his thumb along the blade's edge, not cutting himself but testing its sharpness. I realized in that moment that the Brandon I'd known for 10 years had either never existed or had been completely consumed by whoever he'd become. This wasn't mental illness or unemployment stress. This was calculated, deliberate manipulation. In that moment of absolute terror, something in my brain switched from panic to survival mode. I remembered that my upstairs neighbor, Garrett, was a police officer who often worked evening shifts and might be home. While Brandon continued his chilling monologue about how cooperative I needed to be, I slowly backed toward the wall, where I'd installed a panic button connected to the building's security system 6 months earlier, after a break-in in our building. I'd never had to use it, but I knew it would immediately alert both building security and local police. Brandon was so focused on his speech about his employers and their requirements that he didn't notice my subtle movement. When I was close enough, I slammed my palm against the button and immediately heard the piercing alarm that would bring help. Brandon's calm demeanor shattered instantly. He lunged toward me with the knife, but I managed to dodge and run toward my front door. I was screaming for help at the top of my lungs, and within seconds I heard Garrett's heavy footsteps thundering down the stairs. Brandon realized he was trapped and made a desperate attempt to escape through my fire escape window. But Garrett was already pounding on my door. I unlocked it and practically collapsed into his arms, pointing toward the window where Brandon was struggling with the latch. Garrett called for backup while I gave him a rapid explanation of what had been happening. The police arrived within minutes and found Brandon trying to climb down the fire escape with a backpack full of my personal documents, including printed copies of my emails, photos of my apartment layout, and detailed notes about my daily routines. When they searched his belongings, they discovered he'd been working for some kind of corporate espionage operation that targeted tech workers with valuable intellectual property. Apparently, his unemployment was completely fabricated. He'd been specifically assigned to get close to me because of the software project I was working on. The police found evidence that he'd been recording our conversations, photographing my computer screen, and even installing monitoring software on my devices. He'd been planning to stay indefinitely until he could access my work files and steal the complete technical specifications. The whole desperate friend needing help act had been an elaborate setup from the beginning. Brandon was charged with breaking and entering, attempted assault, theft, and corporate espionage. He's currently serving a 3-year sentence, but the experience has permanently changed how I view trust and friendship. I moved to a different apartment within a month, changed all my passwords and security systems, and now I'm extremely cautious about who I let into my personal space. The worst part is wondering how many other people he's done this to, and whether his employers have found someone else to target. I still check my locks multiple times before bed, and I've never felt quite safe in my own home since.